Hello and welcome to Addressing the COVID-19 Crisis, our weekly open forum webinar series for pharmacists. I'm Michael Hogue, President of the American Pharmacists Association and Dean at Loma Linda University School of Pharmacy. I'll be serving as the moderator for today's program. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we've been doing this for a little over 30 weeks now, trying to provide pharmacists with the latest information that's occurred over the last week and great clinical information related to caring for patients during the COVID crisis. Today, we have a very exciting program for you. We're going to talk about perhaps the hottest topic in pharmacy at this moment, which is COVID-19 vaccines. And we're going to talk about where we're at with the trials. We'll talk about efficacy and safety of the vaccines that are likely to come to market first, including the logistics of storage and handling of those vaccines. And we know that many of you have lots of questions about that. Our guest today is none other than Dr. John Grabenstein. Dr. Grabenstein is a global vaccinologist. He specializes in adult vaccines and implementation of those into practice. His career field has been pretty far reaching. He has served as executive director of global affairs for Merck Vaccines from 2006 to 2019. And he additionally had directed the Department of Defense's vaccination program during the time that he was U.S. Army Colonel. John has been dedicated to educating clinicians about adult vaccines, and he's organized immunization training for many, many years. And on a personal note, I just have to say that it was an honor and a privilege for me to work with John and a wonderful team of staff at APHA back in 1995 and 96 as we developed the pharmacy-based immunization certificate training program. And for those of you that think John's name's familiar, but you just couldn't recall from where, that's from where, that you probably heard John's name. So we're really honored to have him with us. Just like always, we have some subject matter experts from APHA that will also be joining us today when we get to the Q&A section. Mitch Rotholtz, who was another one of those staff members involved in the development of that program on vaccines, as chief of governance and state affiliates for APHA. He'll be sharing his insights in the regulatory realm as it relates to vaccines. And also Dan Zlot, our senior vice president for education business development at APHA. Dan, for those of you who haven't been on our webinar, Dan comes to APHA from NIH, having been involved in National Cancer Institute and oncology and immunology research there at NIH. So he brings those skills to the table. He'll answer our clinical questions that come up on today's webinar. And Michael Baxter will be joining us, Senior Director of Regulatory Policy at APHA, and he'll be covering for us the things that have happened within Washington, D.C., within Congress, and within the regulatory agencies over the last week. Michael will be doing that toward the end of our program today. You don't want to miss it, so you can get the updates directly from Washington on those subjects. Now, we do want this to be an interactive program, and we want to get your questions. We know that many of you probably came into today's webinar with questions about the COVID vaccines. We're going to focus on those, but we'll take your questions about anything related to COVID-19, whether it's vaccine related or otherwise. We've got the experts today to be able to handle your questions. If you would like, you can just click on the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel, type your question as you think of it into that panel. Even if we've not gotten through the presentation, it's good for us to have your questions so that we can keep them top of mind and we can address them as we're going through the webinar. We would like to be able to call on you if you're willing to speak and have your question asked verbally. But the way we do that is you type your question into the question box, and then I'll call on you, and the staff will unmute your line and give you a minute, 60 seconds, to be able to ask your question and receive an answer to your question. If you are connected through your computer's audio, that's a simple process. There's a little microphone icon on the top of your GoToWebinar control panel, and when our staff unmute your line, you just need to click that and make sure that it's green in color, and then we'll be able to hear you ask your question. If you're joining us from a landline phone or a cell phone, then you will need to actually input your audio PIN into the GoToWebinar telephone line now. That will give us the ability to unmute you so that you can speak when time comes. But with all of that, if you don't want to speak or say it out loud, say your question out loud, just type no audio or please ask this question for me, Michael, and then type your question in, and I'll make sure that we get to your question. We'll answer as many questions as we possibly can during today's webinar. I do want to remind you, we are recording today's webinar. You can go to pharmacist.com and click on the COVID-19 resources page. And within 24 hours, we'll have today's webinar posted. You'll be able to listen to that and share it with your friends. And we'd encourage you to do that, especially on your social media platforms, so that others can hear the great information that's going to be shared today. The handout for today's webinar is available to you for download on the Handouts tab. Just click on that. All of the links that are provided in the handout are active links. You can just click on them. It'll take you right to the web resource that's being referenced on the slides. And again, that's also available to you at pharmacist.com in the COVID-19 resources page. So with that, we've got a lot of information to cover, and we want to jump into it right away. So John Grabenstein, please join me on screen. John, it's great to have you with us. Welcome.
Michael, it's great to be with you. Thanks for the chance to talk to everybody.
Well, we've got a lot to cover in today's program. Everyone's curious about what's going on with COVID-19 vaccines. I guess to kind of tee things up, would you just at least start out with a little bit about where we are with COVID? We're hearing a lot that the pandemic is getting worse, not better. Maybe you could share with us just a little bit of information about where we are right now with the pandemic as a good lead-in.
Great, thanks. Brian, can you go to the next slide? I'd like to show this graphically. I've got the Earth and the total U.S. counts of cases, which is basically lab confirmed cases usually, and then the death toll. And as scientists, if any of you heard, the pandemic will go away after Election Day, that's certainly not true, and you knew that long ago. You can see three. They've been called waves. I'd rather call them surges because of that middle hump was more of a Midwest thing than an Eastern U.S. thing that the first hump was. But you can see the third one rising now. I saw statistics. The case count, I guess yesterday, was over 100,000 new cases, lab confirmed. And so in music, I think this is a crescendo. You know, it's worse than it's ever been, and that curve is going up.
Yeah, well, there's no question that we're seeing increased case rates across many states. And John, what you recommend for pharmacists as the best source to be able to get information that they can rely on as accurate and reliable?
CDC in one thing, your health departments are. Of course, going to be important sources of local information. So those should be quite helpful to you.
So let's dive into the COVID vaccines now. I think on our next slide here, we've got a little bit of a graphic that you've created for us about the different COVID vaccines. Pharmacists have been immunizing for about 25 years now. It's hard to believe, but that's where we are. What's similar, what's different about the COVID-19 vaccine campaign?
So those first two rows, the live attenuated vaccines and the inactivated vaccines, are what pharmacists deal with most often day to day. Subunit vaccines are not unusual either. What's relatively new are nucleic acid vaccines, especially mRNA vaccines, messenger RNA vaccines, and then viral vector vaccines. There's an example or two, but they're not very common. We've got in the backup slides detail about that viral vector row that I'm not going to go through now, but it'll be available to everybody to have as a reference if they go to the pharmacist.com website. But I thought in the next few slides we'd spend more time on the messenger RNA vaccines, because they are the ones that are going to come through the pipeline first, and for a variety of reasons. And so we thought we'd dive deep there. You'll notice that in Blueprint, there's a reference to one of the 15 on COVID-19 sessions that Dan Zlot ran about mRNA vaccines that'll go into a little more technical detail than I'm going to go into. These are, as Dan points out in that talk, mRNA vaccine candidates or mRNA products have been around for clinical trials for quite a number of years, but this would be their first big time in the spotlight. So there's a good number of years of effort, but not all that many recipients, and so that's a key distinguishing point.
Well, and so today, for our listeners' sake, again, just to remind you, at the end of today's slide deck, if you download the handouts, there are some additional details about the mRNA and DNA vaccines that are found at the end of your slides, and you can take a look at those. Now, the reason that we are going to dive in to the mRNA vaccines is that what we know, based upon where things are with the clinical trials right now, that the first two vaccine candidates likely to come to market either through an emergency use authorization or some sort of an approval will be mRNA vaccines. And so that's why we've chosen today to focus primarily on those vaccines in our information that we're going to share. So don't you think, John, the slide 13 here, it'll tell us a little bit more of why we're going to focus here.
Yeah, Brian, why don't you advance one more? Great. So the two leading mRNA candidates are one from Moderna and one from BioNTech, is a German company that was the discoverer or the primary developer. They've partnered with Pfizer to develop these products. They're both mRNA products. You see the product designator that they use to keep track of it. The messenger RNA is a relatively fragile protein, and so how do you keep it from being degraded? It's sort of like you can't swallow insulin, or well, you can, but the molecule would not have any biological activity. They need to keep the mRNA active and not degraded long enough to get into cells, and so the way to do that is to surround it with a lipid, and they're really tiny, so it's a nanoparticle. And it's a suspension, so it's a dispersion. So all the pharmaceutical kinds of things, but that's the physical form, the dosage form that's involved. It's also you'll see eventually that it relates to storage conditions. They haven't had enough time to refine the formulation so that it's refrigerator stable. We'll talk about that. The mRNAs are these are little strips of amino acids, little polypeptides. They are essentially synthesized rather than grown in fermenters or bioreactors, so they're synthetic to that scent. But they're not produced in cells, so there's no issues related to the type of cells they are. Intramuscular injection, 2-dose products, and the efficacy values that will be determined in the phase 3 trial rely on getting the second dose. So we know one of the questions already is how do we get people back for their second dose? We'll talk about that, but you need to get them back for the second dose. Both have good positive animal challenge data in non-human primates, macaques usually, and so the vaccines are protecting the animals against intentional challenge with virus. And they also, from the phase 1 trials, we know that both of the products induce neutralizing antibodies and also induce T cell responses, T lymphocyte responses. And so that's everything. So far, everything we want to see in a vaccine candidate has been materializing. So people's hopes are up that all the data so far is looking good. And now the proof will be in the pudding with the phase 3 trials.
I know our listeners are going to be anxious to hear about safety. We've already started getting questions about that. We're going to address safety in just a few slides. So, folks, thanks for asking those questions, and we will get to the safety information. But first, as we'll show here on our next slide, I want to talk about storage and handling, John, the logistics. And, pharmacies are being relied upon heavily to be able to operationalize, let's say, the vaccination program. Talk to us about the storage and handling of the vaccines.
Right. So we'll go from the top to the bottom, but you see the dose is a little different. It's just doesn't mean that one's better or worse than the other. They're just a little different, and that's the right measurement for that product. Both are frozen liquids, so
John,
they're.
could I just interrupt you just a second?
Sure.
One thing I want to make sure that our listeners heard correctly. These are not equivalent doses. So that doesn't mean the Moderna vaccine is 3 times stronger than the Pfizer vaccine. So do not make that interpretation, correct?
That's
That's
exactly
an
right.
important distinction. Yeah.
This is not. These are that you said it perfectly. They are not. That it simply is. These are full doses to for each of the products individually. So it's not a comparative thing. They're both
Yeah.
frozen
Go ahead.
liquids.
Sorry.
That's all right. They're both frozen liquids, so it's like a popsicle, right? Frozen liquid. 5 or 10 dose vials. There are no preservatives in these vials. What does that mean? If you pierce the plunger or the stopper of the vial, you can, if you don't use good technique, introduce bacteria into the container, and historically we've had examples of people getting staph infections or streptococcal infections from contaminated products. So there's no preservative, so you must throw it away at the end of the day, essentially. But you can get the full all 5 doses, all 10 doses out, but you can't keep the vial, put it back in the refrigerator, put it back into storage. So
That's pretty critical information.
These are fragile proteins. So the Moderna is a ship at minus 20 degrees centigrade. That's quite cold. That's 0 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit. I forget which. It's not too cold. It can be stored refrigerated for not more than 7 days, and room temperature not more than 12 days. And I should say that the values in those cells are the best data we have now, and the companies are continuing to do more stability studies. You may see them relaxed, you might not over time, so just stay attuned to what the current information is. The BioNTech Pfizer product must be kept colder. Ultra cold is the typical phrase used, and it's at dry ice conditions. It's minus 70 or 75 centigrade. That's minus 90 something Fahrenheit. That's way beyond ice cream, folks. That is really, really cold. And so Pfizer, we'll show you a picture. Pfizer's got some special shipping containers designed to sustain that ultra cold temperature. We'll show you a picture in a minute. At the end, just before use, it can come back up to refrigerated temperatures, not more than 5 days at this point, to best information available to me. Room temperature, it needs to be, remember it's a frozen liquid. So when you thaw it, it'll become a liquid. It needs to be diluted from that concentrated state to a less concentrated liquid. So you'll need to add some fluid to it. I'm assuming saline. And so that'll be a step that you'll need to take into account. And then and this is true for both of them, no preservative, so throw it away at the end of the shift.
Yeah,
they're both in phase 3 trials now. Both companies are saying that they may have enough information to apply to the FDA for an emergency use authorization, EUA, in late November. And by the time the FDA deals with that application, I'm predicting no vaccine in the field until the middle of December, but we'll see.
And I do want to remind our listeners too that just a few weeks ago, we had guests on our show from the CDC who shared a lot of information about the federal government's plan for distribution of these vaccines when they do eventually come to market, including how they're going to manage the cold chain from the time of distribution. If you weren't able to join us for that week's call, please go to pharmacist.com. On the COVID-19 resources page, you can actually go back and listen to all of our past COVID-19 webinars, and I would encourage folks to do that if you'd like to dive deeper into the storage and handling. Now, John, you mentioned something called emergency use authorization. Could you tell us what is an EUA? We have no shortages of abbreviations in the profession of pharmacy and in medicine.
Yeah, 26 letters we can rearrange anyway. So it's an intermediate step. It's a pathway to availability, but it's I think of it as, you know, there's not enough information. Let me get both hands on the screen here. There's not enough information to warrant licensing, but there's a point where it just gets past that tipping point, and it's enough that the FDA says, okay, in an emergency, let's go ahead and make it available, but it's not full licensure. So it's a part of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. It's to give access, in this case, to an unlicensed vaccine. The FDA weighs the known and the potential benefits against the known and the potential risks. And it's actually that regulatory pathway is how you got access to a lot of COVID-19 diagnostic tests in a hurry, right? Because they didn't have time to do the full usual process. It's an emergency use authorization. It's how new suppliers of N95 masks got accessed, and remdesivir was in EUA status for a number of months. Well, how could it be that there's enough information to let it out by an EUA, but not enough for a license? Well, let's say we have the clinical trial results, but the manufacturer hasn't finished making the 3 consistency lots that they're required to make to show production quality. Well, that would be a reason to speed things up. The results could be positive, but Peter Marks from FDA said the application for a license is literally over 100,000 pages long. Now there was a time when pharma would hire trucks to send them to FDA. Now it's electronic, but it's incredible amount of data. Is it a low quality or a substandard approval? Well, it's not an approval, it's an authorization, it's a stopgap. But as long as the objective evidence is there, no, it is enough data to warrant access. There's a whole bunch of rules and regs you'd have to follow. I'm not going to take time on that, but just to say that there would be not a vaccine information statement like you're used to. There'd be a fact sheet. You don't have to collect consent forms, but the fact sheet has to be given to the potential recipient, and it's voluntary. And we'll take the rest in questions.
So there's a lot of differences here with EUAs, and again, I just encourage folks to reference back to this slide. I think it's very good information. Now, for those of you who are following along in your handouts, you discovered that I skipped a slide, and I skipped some pretty important information about Pfizer's storage because that negative 70-degree temperature is pretty darn cold. So tell us about how they're going to actually make this work, and how does a pharmacist get a little bit more information about it?
Well, so look at the middle of that schematic where it says payload. So if you may need to get up close to your screen, but you can see that there's looks like there's 5 rows in that cube, and each of those rows or trays has been called a pizza box. And imagine, it takes time and to put a vial in a box. And so one way to speed things up and actually reduce temperature exposure too is to have the vials touching each other, or maybe little cardboard dividers, but all in a bigger box rather than individually boxed. And so what Pfizer expects is that each of those 5 trays is going to have 900 and something doses in it. They will be bundled together. There'll be dry ice on top of it. They'll go into that shipping container that you see there, and insulated sufficiently to keep it at that minus 70 something degrees centigrade, minus 90 Fahrenheit temperature for a certain number of days or hours, and then the dry ice can be replenished. one of the questions, anticipating one of the questions that came in early, it's going to take time to keep these things cold, and it's going to take staff resources. And you may, if you're involved in this, you may need to dedicate some people who are going to follow the instructions to the letter to make sure product quality is sustained.
Yeah. And, John, we've asked you to come today to really talk about these first two vaccines that are coming to market. And I know as our pharmacists listening to this, you're seeing this and saying, holy cow, this is going to be a logistical nightmare. It may be very difficult for pharmacies to, in some cases, to get really involved, especially with this sub-zero freezing temperature product. We will bring John back on the show when we see that we're getting closer with some of the other vaccine candidates that are out there, when they're getting a little closer to market, because some of those products have very different storage parameters and different storage requirements. And so we will get to that eventually, but today we just wanted to focus on what we thought would be the most practical things for you to implement into practice over the next 6 weeks or so as these products are coming in. Now, John, let's get to safety, because it's a huge question on everybody's mind. We're getting tons of questions in the questions box about this already. What do we know about vaccine safety with the COVID vaccines?
So
and
CDC
in particular.
Yeah, CDC and the FDA are going to do all their usual safety monitoring plus a cell phone based monitoring system that's going to be called vSafe, and they'll be convening weekly to look at all of the reports that come in. Just about the center of that slide, you'll see reference to VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, and that's one that the public seems to focus on because they think of individual case reports, and that's important. It's a spontaneous reporting system. It doesn't have the scientific power that some of the other surveillance systems had. So I like to put emphasis on the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which is taking large computer databases so that 1 million people can be looked at all at once. And there's a reason for wanting to make those comparisons. I'll show you in just a moment. But over on the left-hand panel is a different document that I culled from one of the CDC websites, but you can see expanded safety monitoring systems, existing safety monitoring systems, members of the military, general public, et cetera. So, I mean, this is a multifaceted, it's not enough just to look at it this way. They're going to look at it this way. They're going to look at it this way. There's all the strengths and all the limitations of any one of these approaches is countered by some other program that has that as a strength. And so the sum of all these things is why we should be confident that that safety is being monitored very intensely. Let's go to the next slide. Or ask a question, but I want to tell you some stories.
Yeah, I want to hear your stories, but before we do that, I just want to ask a question about these two mRNA vaccines. John, have you seen the safety data from the phase 2 trials, and do you have any concerns personally? I mean, I know I've read them, but I'd like, you hold a tremendous amount of credibility. We really want to hear what's on your mind. Are you concerned about any of the safety information you saw in the phase 2 trials that have been published on either one of these mRNA vaccines?
I have no concern at all. Shots hurt. They got injection site side effects. There were reports of fever and malaise and lethargy and headache and those sorts of things, as happens in all trials. So I actually called some folks over at the University of Maryland, willing to volunteer to be in these trials, but I wasn't willing to drive across the Chesapeake Bay Bridge to get there. So I didn't sign up for the trials, but it was because of logistics, not because of fear of side effects of the vaccine.
Okay, yeah. I want to remind our listeners again, we also had Dr. Shimabukuro from CDC He's the vaccine safety officer for the Centers for Disease Control, and we had an officer from the FDA on our show a few weeks ago as well. So again, another one of these weekly webinars where we dove deeper into vaccine safety, and actually Tom went through what the FDA and the CDC are doing in terms of post-marketing surveillance to make sure that that the vaccines are not only safe in the trials up to this point, but we're continually looking for safety signals to be able to ensure that the supply is safe. And I think that's important. I would encourage pharmacists to take time to listen to those two programs if you haven't. Now, John, you've got some experiences with flu vaccine campaigns when we've had vaccines come to market quickly. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are about that. I think we got some picture of President Ford here, it looks like.
Gerald Ford getting his swine flu vaccine in 1976. This is one story of a mirage and one story of reality. So the mirage was that in October of 76, 3 people died of heart attacks after getting a swine flu vaccination on the same day, all in Pittsburgh. And, you know, newspaper headlines went crazy, but nobody had bothered to check how many people die of a heart attack in Pittsburgh in October on any one day. And it was way more than 3. And so, yes, they're all 3 coincidental bad events, but it was coincidental. It was not, this was no change from the usual rates of heart attack deaths in a big city. So that's, I call that a mirage. It looked like a problem, but it wasn't a problem. But then contrast that with the recognition in November of Guillain-Barré syndrome, the neuroparalytic syndrome in vaccine recipients. And there was one report and then another one and then another one and then another one and another one. And it was a true cause and effect relationship of an elevated risk due to vaccines, 4 times the rate in the vaccinated group compared to the unvaccinated group. That one was a true cause and effect relationship. And so when these vaccination programs for COVID get rolled out, there will be adverse events, and you saw it in some of the clinical trial holds, but whether that's cause and effect needs review, not knee-jerk assumptions.
So, John, I'm going to ask a question from a couple of our audience members. Folks, we're going to start taking your questions now. I've got a couple who don't have audio who would like for me to ask their questions on their behalf. So if you have questions, please type those into the question box. Question from Matt Tochik is, can you explain the rationale for doing phase 2 and phase 3 trials concurrently? And what's the benefit of that? Explain why that's happening in this circumstance, or why this is seems to be happening.
Right. So we start with 1,000 people a day are dying of this infection. You know, it's a bad pandemic. It's the worst public health crisis in 100 years. So how do we speed up a solution, a vaccine, to solve that, and at the same time, you know, not cut corners and gather all the data that needs to be gathered? And it was by doing steps almost simultaneously, not quite. I should do it the other way. Not quite simultaneously. The phase 2 study were started. They got some preliminary data, and then they started phase 3 before they got all the data. And so, in a nutshell, by doing things nearly simultaneously, all the steps are being conducted. So that's a little bit risky in money of investment, but without short-circuiting the quality of the information to be received.
Yeah. Barry Bunting doesn't have audio, but has a question for you, John. Will we need to be careful not to shake the frozen material when thawing? Is there any concerns about that kind of stability in terms of the jostling the vial?
So they're proteins. So, I mean, even insulin, you know, you don't shake the vial so much that you get frothing, right? There may be a gentle agitation comment, but I'm sure that there'll be something about no vigorous shaking.
Yeah. Meredith Goodwin has just put a question in the chat box, and I'm going to ask the staff if they would unmute Meredith Goodwin, Goodwin. Meredith Goodwin, we're going to unmute your line and let you ask your question. Looks like she may need us to ask the question for her. When will a package insert be available? Will the package insert, so to speak, for these vaccines come with the EUA, or will the two manufacturers release that early so that pharmacists can familiarize themselves with the content?
So if you didn't know, package inserts have to be approved by the FDA. So there won't be anything until so the sequence of steps is the company requests the EUA, and then the FDA reviews it, actually goes to its advisory committee, and then issues it. I doubt that there would be any release of the official PI until that release.
That makes sense. Okay. And one thing we didn't talk about was what are we anticipating in terms of age approvals for these vaccines when they first come to market with the EUA? Are these going to be used in children? Are they going to be used in adults? Will it be okay to use them in seniors? What are you anticipating with that, John?
So if I don't see a slide number, but if that comparative chart is being projected, look down at the bottom row, ages in the phase 3 trials, and you'll see both companies have basically a young adult to 64 year age, 18 to 64, 12 to 56 arm, and a 65 plus arm. And so there'll be two numbers reported out, one for the mid-adult group and one for the older adult group. And they might be a little bit different. And assuming they're both positive, the company would get an indication for both age ranges. Now, this is SARS-CoV-2 is a adult-centric infection. Obviously, children do get it, but it's not the prime focus of the pathogen. Anytime you do a vaccine study, you always start off with adults, and then you go to figuratively teenagers, and then you go to grade schoolers, and then you go to toddlers, and only then do you go to infants. And so I expect they're gonna, I think, want to see confirmation of efficacy in adults, and then you'll see more trials to younger age groups, but it's going to take more time.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that makes this so different from H1N1. So H1N1, we immunized children first. That was part of our strategy, but that won't be the case.
We knew flu vaccines worked in kids, right? So
that's exactly right. Yeah. So, well, we've got a lot of shy people today who are saying, please ask this question for me. Please ask this question for me. So I'll do that really quick. We'll start diving into a few more of these. Will all pharmacists, have first access as healthcare professionals, or only those actively vaccinating patients? And I think what our question asker is getting here is the World Health Organization on a global scale, and then the National Academies of Medicine recommendations for prioritization, and some of the public information about the ACIP's discussions up to this point on prioritization talk about healthcare professionals being vaccinated first. So we do know that pharmacists are included as healthcare professionals in all of those documents. So that part we can say affirmatively that pharmacists are included as healthcare professionals. The question, John, is do they have to be actively caring for patients to be able to receive the vaccine in that first cohort, or is it just by the fact that they're pharmacists that they could potentially get vaccinated?
We're not going to have enough vaccine initially to spread the peanut butter as far as we would like to spread the peanut butter. And so there's going to have to be hard choices made about prioritization. I would assume, and these decisions haven't been made yet, that it's patient-focused, patient-facing individuals who would go before, figuratively, office building sitting professionals. So just because you have a degree or a license doesn't mean you'd be high up. It's because of your patient encounters that would gain you extra points.
Okay. We've got a great question here from Ann Pelk. I'll ask. This is a really important logistics question. So you mentioned that both vaccines are going to come in 5-dose vials.
One 5 and one 10.
That's right. One's 5 and one 10. Will pharmacists need to go ahead and draw up all of the doses out of the vial at one time within that 6-hour window, or will you just draw one dose up and administer it, draw another dose up and administer it, draw another dose up and administer it? And then how long is the vaccine stable in a syringe? You mentioned in the vial it's 6 hours after you brought it up. So what about in the syringe?
I don't know the stability in the syringe, and not all syringes are made equal. Are made of the same components, so there probably will be little information about stability in the syringe. So I anticipate that the answer will be draw it up just as you use it. Well, first of all, use good technique and don't put any bacteria into the vial. All right, that's rule number one. If you inadvertently did and you put it back in, a cooling condition for refrigerator, and then a couple of hours took it out again to give another dose, it should be fine. The bacteria would not have multiplied in that intervening time. But the other thing is that in the initial stages, the product's going to be shipped to places where it will be high volume throughput, I would expect. So I don't think this is probably going to be much of an issue.
Okay. A couple more logistics questions here that I think are really important. We want to make sure we get these. As far as administration goes, do we need to have a COVID vaccine under an immunization protocol? Well, this is kind of a policy question, John. I'll let you answer it. And of course, if we need to, we can call on Mike Baxter to join us. But John, go ahead.
Yeah, so, so you got to follow the law and you got to follow the state law. But I think the federal emergency statements have they literally made the pharmacist the prescriber? The question is, who's the prescriber? And you can tell me what the federal opinion says.
Yeah, so the HHS federal opinion authorizes pharmacists to prescribe COVID-19 vaccine and administer it. And in fact, you can prescribe it and have your technician administer it if they're qualified. You can prescribe it and have your student pharmacist administer it if they're qualified. So as with the COVID-19 vaccine under the emergency, under the PrEP Act, you do have as pharmacists the ability to prescribe it. You do not have to include it under a protocol arrangement. So that's very important information. I'm glad you've asked that question. It was right on and good for us to reemphasize this. One more storage question, John. How long is the Pfizer product stable at -70? So they've started manufacturing this product way in advance of it ever getting an EUA. Do we have any idea how many doses have been stockpiled and how long is it going to be stable without a preservative in it?
Well, so the company knows, I don't know. Usually at that cold, when it's that cold, molecule, the Brownian motion slows down. And so it's probably pretty stable. How many doses have been stockpiled? The Pfizer CEO gave an investor call for Wall Street a week ago, I guess. And he said that they had hundreds of thousands of doses ready. I'm interpreting that to be in vials, packaged, but that surely does not count all the product that would be at the intermediate production steps. And so their contractual obligation to Uncle Sam is to have 20 or 30 or maybe 40 million doses by the end of the year, by the end of December. So there's not going to be enough peanut butter on day one to go around, but more will come with each week, each month, and as the manufacturing ramps up.
Yeah, let's talk about immunity. One of the things you emphasized early on is that second dose is really, really important. If I remember correctly, in the phase 2 trials with one of the two vaccines, there's only about 18% of people who seroconvert after the first dose. The second dose gets us up to what percent in the phase 2
high
trial?
90s, or if not 100. I mean, almost everybody's seroconverted, as I remember the numbers. Without going to, I mean, I can look it up, but I don't think that's the
I think
point.
you're right. It's close to 100. Yeah.
There's 2 points on the second dose. A, you need to document the first dose, and it's got to be in one or more computers, and it should be on the patient's Panama paper record as a backup. And then call them back for dose 2 of the same brand. And so how can you call them back? What do you do for prescription reminders? Are you part of a health system that has a portal that can send out targeted messages? There was a question about payers. Can payers help with that? Or just, broadcasting, these people are eligible for dose 1, and don't forget, if you've got dose 1, you need to come back for dose 2. Pull all your tricks out of your book.
Okay. John, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to bring Mitch Rotholtz on to deal with some payment for vaccine issues that we're going to talk about, and Mike Baxter. So let me ask you this one last question. We don't know anything yet, do we, about duration of protection from vaccination? And do we anticipate that this is going to be sort of like the flu shot, that you're going to have to get an annual dose of vaccine, or what are you expecting on that in your crystal ball?
We don't know fundamentally, and so we need to get started and then find out later. The only way to know is to wait a few years and find out. So we'll find out in real time. The folks in the trials will be some of the first clues. You've seen a lot lately about, immunity to natural infection wears off quickly. I don't find that impressive. I want to know what the vaccine does. This is a disadvantage with mRNAs and the adenovirus vectors, is we have less experience with them than others. But if we need another dose in a year, so okay, fine. We know how to handle that. If it's longer, okay, fine. We know how to handle that too.
Well, John, thanks for joining us. I know that you've got a lot on your plate, and taking time out of your day to join us for this webinar is important. John has also shared with us some information about the Immunization Action Coalition. We've got that information listed on a slide here for you, that are resources that you can use from immunize.org. Is there anything, as you depart and we bring the other members of our team on, that you'd like to say about these resources?
They're free, and there's lots of them. And we have a immunize.org, or Immunization Action Coalition, has a big tradition of making available resources in multiple languages. And if you've got new staff that need to learn injection technique or something, I was talking to Mike Cullen, the medication error guy, earlier today. We got new, there could be new nurses who were in some other clinic that suddenly are going to be doing a lot of vaccinating. Make sure everybody does it well. We avoid errors, and we communicate with the patient.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's great. Now, folks, we're not done with the webinar. We've got lots of information. We're going to let John go, but we're going to bring Mitch Rotholtz on and Mike Baxter on. So Mike and Mitch, if you two would join me, we are getting a lot of questions in the chat box about reimbursement for for COVID vaccine. So I'm going to take a few of those questions. And before I do, Mike, I know we've got a couple of slides that cover immunization reimbursement and some news from CMS. I wonder if you could cover those couple of slides for us now, so that I can take some questions to you and to Mitch that are coming in from the audience.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you, Michael. And as you mentioned, CMS this week last week released a long-awaited, fourth interim final rule with comment. It requires the reimbursement for administration of the COVID-19 vaccines. Really fixes an issue when Congress passed the CARES Act, which was a quick federal response to the pandemic. And when they passed that, they said that the vaccines had to be FDA approved. Well, we know it's going to probably come out, and as you mentioned, under emergency use authorization. So this fixes that and says that they're going to require reimbursement from all payers for an FDA authorized or approved EUA COVID-19 vaccine. More importantly, and what these questions are probably about, is what's the reimbursement for that, for the administration of it. You can see on the slide there, they actually released the reimbursement rates for Medicare. That payment rate is $28.39 for a single dose vaccine. For 2 or more doses, you get $16.94 for the initial dose, $28.39 for the final dose, and that's adjusted by geography, and it seems very reasonable. However, this is to take into account that these are the vaccines that the government has purchased. So down the road, obviously, there might be another reimbursement for the product itself, but this is just for the administration of that. A lot of people are like, sure.
Can I just interrupt you there? I want to just point out to our listeners. So the 2 vaccines that we talked about today, the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine, the mRNA vaccines, are both vaccines that require 2 doses. So under the CMS rule, the vaccine is a contracted vaccine, and it will cost you as the pharmacist nothing. That vaccine will be provided to you for free, and it will cost the patient nothing. And the reimbursement that you'll receive will be for the administration fee. And this is the rate at which you'll be paid. And so this gives you very specific information. Providers have been asking this. Mike, go ahead.
Sure. No, it's great. Thank you. And also, we get a lot of questions, and I'm sure a lot of questions are probably out there too. What about my state, right? So what about Medicaid, CHIP, if we have a basic health program? What about private plans? Well, they didn't really mandate that. They said, because obviously Medicaid's a joint federal state program, and states determine a lot of these rates, but they said they want you to base your administration rates on those Medicare rates. So while they haven't been announced by your state yet, you can show them that in the interim final rule and say, well, the federal government's saying you should match or at least match these rates as well going forward. So that's a very important fact to point out. I would also point out that they mentioned a lot of expedited ways to enroll if you want to be an immunizer as a pharmacy. So as a pharmacist working at a pharmacy, there's an expedited 24-hour enrollment process for a hotline that's available. You call up and they're going to make the determination and send you that within 24 hours for your pharmacy for you to be a mass immunizer. They have centralized billing. So if you already offer it, vaccinations in multiple jurisdictions, you can kind of consolidate that into one kind of bill that you can send to one Medicare administrative contract or a MAC, so it makes the billing a lot easier. They also mentioned in the future there's going to be maybe additional direct billing opportunities, but they're working with CDC to figure all that out. We did ask for some clarifications from CMS, and we got some for those who are currently out there. So if you're currently a pharmacy right now and you're enrolled under Medicare Part B for medical services, or if you're a mass immunizer, and you can also already do the roster billing, you don't have to do anything different. You're going to bill this the same as you bill for the flu vaccine and other vaccines. However, if you're a diabetes self-management training, if you provide that and you can directly bill for that, you don't have to roster bill. And also, if you went ahead and registered as a pharmacy as an independent clinical laboratory, or if you're a durable medical equipment supplier, you have to enroll separately in Medicare as a mass immunizer to bill for this and do the roster billing for the COVID-19 vaccine. So you're going to have to call your Medicare administrative contractor for that. They also issued a bunch of toolkits too, and we're happy to follow up with folks on that. There's a lot of operational considerations to consider when you're doing this. We went over a lot of those during the call today. Know if it's 1 or 2 doses, take into account the vaccine distribution and work with your state health departments on that. And also you're going to have to sign that pharmacy and provider agreement with the federal government to get the free vaccines and the supplies. And if you have any insured patients, uninsured patients, there's a process through HRSA, the Health Resources and Services Administration, to bill for that. But that's all I had for that update, and I can take questions if you want.
That's great, and we'll have Mitch join you as well. I want to ask a few process questions just real quickly, and I know we're limited on time, but I want to try to get to these because there's so many questions about payment. Mitch, can you speak to us at all about the U.S. government has announced for long-term care facilities a contract with 2 national pharmacy chains to be able to immunize. Do you know, will there be additional opportunities for other pharmacy chains, regional or national, as well as independent pharmacies to be involved with COVID-19 vaccination campaigns going forward? Or do these contracts take care of all of the COVID vaccine that's going to be distributed by the government? Can you speak to that, Mitch?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So the agreements that were signed were focused on long-term care provision, thinking that long-term care patients and workers are going to be part of the initial targeted audience populations to get vaccinated. So given, as John talked about, the limited vaccine supply, they're trying to prioritize and hone in on practitioners and providers who could manage the supply and all the requirements related to that. There are conversations that are going on currently as we speak to try to look at pockets where there's gaps in availability of providers and to potentially enter into other agreements so that we can cover the whole country, especially like rural areas and other areas across the country. So there are ongoing conversations for the long-term care, what I would call, phase 1B, 1A, 1B. But on phase 2, where there's more supply that's going to be available, there are ongoing conversations with other community pharmacies, as well as networks that represent independent pharmacies as well. And within probably the next week, we'll have more announcements being made of other engaged providers there. Also, there is also the mechanism of entering into a provider agreement with your state jurisdiction, so your health departments. And so the health departments are starting to issue that process out to providers now. So check with your state if that's the right mechanism that you're going to go through.
And I want to point out to our listeners, as shown on our next slide, APHA is going to be releasing a vaccine payment issue brief likely tomorrow, and that'll be available on pharmacist.com. We encourage you to go there and download it and use it, to use the information. It's designed for that. We think this will answer a lot of your questions about how the reimbursement process for the vaccines are going to work. I'm going to ask Dan Zlot to answer the following question. Dan, if we need to get a pharmacy technician trained to be able to help administer immunizations, how would we do that?
Michael, that's a great question. So APHA has recently partnered with Washington State University to deliver a technician immunization training program. That's available for licensure through a number of our different partners. And so if you have technicians that need to be trained, please reach out to us and we can help you identify partners in your area that can train technicians. If you're in the position to license the program itself and you'd like to be able to train technicians for yourself and for your company, again, please reach out to us and we'll get you set up with that. We also have lots of other immunization-related resources, pediatric-specific training in case pharmacists or technicians are not familiar with, comfortable with pediatric immunizations, if they just need a refresher. So we have lots and lots of education resources for both technicians and for pharmacists.
Well, for those of you who had clinical questions or questions about the vaccines that didn't get answered today, I'm pleased to tell you that John Grabenstein has agreed that he will take the questions that we were unable to get answered today, and he is going to take some time this afternoon to put in writing the responses to your questions that we didn't get to, and we're going to post those on the Engage platform. The Engage platform is APHA's member engagement portal. It's the place where pharmacists can interact with each other and discuss the current things that are going on in COVID-19. And so Engage platform COVID-19 community, which reminds me, if you're not an APHA member, let me encourage you to join. APHA is working very hard day in and day out for pharmacists across the nation, and we need you to join us to help support our efforts. So please take a moment and join APHA today if you're not already. APHA has updated its COVID-19 resources, Know the Facts, and many of the questions that we got today, as well as have been getting on our Engage platform, are related to pharmacists' authority to immunize. What can pharmacists do under these new authorities? What can technicians do? What can pharmacy students do? We've updated this resource for you, and it's available. If you just click on the link here on the slide, it'll take you directly to our practice resources page, and you can get the latest information about the HHS authorities that have been given to us. In addition, we have updated our testing basics. And this, I think, you're going to find very helpful. We have all kinds of information about the tests that pharmacists conduct and how those work, and including the legal information about the authority to test for COVID-19 and how that works, as well as how it works for pharmacy interns and for pharmacy technicians. So again, we've provided you with a link. It'll take you straight to the page that you need in order to be able to get these important updates. Now, we have also done something that we think you're going to find extremely valuable. For those of you who are members of APHA, we have accredited our Pharmacy Models for COVID-19 Testing resource for continuing education. Yes, that's right. You heard me right. You can get an hour of CE for simply completing this COVID-19 testing models resource. So again, click right on the link and you can, if you're a member of APHA, you can get this resource for free. There is a small fee for people who are not members of APHA in order to get this CE. Now, let me invite you all to what will be one of the most phenomenal educational sessions of the fall coming up in about a week. There is the Joint Federal Pharmacy Seminar. This is a time when our federal pharmacists come together to talk about contemporary issues. This year, we are opening this up to anyone who wants to attend. There's over 20 hours of CE. It's just $99 to register. That's quite a bargain. And there will be a lot of really late breaking information from the feds on COVID-19, testing, emergency preparedness, operations and formulary management during the COVID crisis, and of course, other clinical updates that are not related to COVID, but that are very important in today's practice. And so we would encourage you to take advantage of this great opportunity to sit at home and get 20 hours of CE for just $99. And the registration link for Joint Forces is right here on the slide. Now, I want to just tell you that next week is our continuing education week. So once a month, we offer continuing education for our COVID-19 webinar series. And so next week, we're going to have a discussion about the ethics of prioritizing vaccines. So some of you had questions about who will get vaccine first. The ACIP has a framework that they're going to be following in order to make recommendations on who should get vaccinated first. They have given us some indication in their public meetings held recently that healthcare professionals will be in the first tier that will get immunized in the US. But then what happens after tier 1 has not been clearly articulated. So we'll want to pay close attention to that. And there are some legal and ethical implications for pharmacists that you'll need to pay really close attention to so that we don't come crossways with what the public health officials are recommending. So we'll have great discussion next week, and CE will be available for those who join us live. There will not be CE available asynchronously, but if you join us live on the program next week, you can get an hour of CE for next week's program. Hey, thanks for everything that you do. It's great that you've been with us today to expand your knowledge about COVID-19 vaccines. We thank you for that. We'll have John Grabenstein back again in the future when we have more information about other vaccines that come to market. In the meantime, keep doing the great things that you're doing in your community. We're proud of you and we're thankful for you each and every day. Have a great day and God bless.